In this video, we'll cover how to use SAP HANA Cloud as the targeted database instead of SQLite, and also how to deploy the application to SAP Cloud Platform with its Cloud Foundry runtime environment. So first of all, let's have a look at what we already have in place. So we are running our application in the Business Application Studio locally, so in this kind of virtual machine. And we are using a file-based database called BookshopDB as a SQLite database. We have defined our target database in the package JSON, where we've defined that our database is of kind SQLite, and the actual file is called BookshopDB. As you may have noticed while doing the exercises, I'm running on a slightly older version of CAP. So if we compare the versions of your Business Application Studio and mine, I'm still running on CD SDK 1.8.5, and the CDS module is 3.34.2. So it could happen that your package JSON looks slightly different. So let's update the CD SDK version, which is our package for executing and using CDS CLI commands. And if we have a look at the CDS version now, so if we have a look at the CDS version now, it should point CD SDK to the newest version. The CDS package is still on an older version. If we have a look at the information of that package, we'll see that there is a new version already available on the registry, 4.1.7. The CD SDK package is installed globally because we need the CDS CLI project independent, but we do have an outdated CDS version in our package JSON. Therefore, let's bump up the version also here in the dependency section. And if we execute npm install, we'll see that also the CDS version in our project will be updated. As you can see, we are having the most current CDS package and also the newest development kit. So how do we basically add a HANA database to our project? So there's one hard requirement to get started with SAP HANA Cloud in trial. You need a HANA Cloud trial instance, which you need to create yourself. So my friend and colleague Thomas Young has already created a 30-minute tutorial about how to get started with SAP HANA Cloud trial. To continue with this exercise, please go on, watch this video and create a SAP HANA Cloud trial instance. You can then use the CDS CLI once again to add the needed configuration to your project. Therefore, let's have a look at the CDS add command. And there's a section which is called CDS add HANA, add configuration for SAP HANA deployment. So let's do so and add the configuration to our project. In parallel, we'll observe what happens to the package.json. Your package.json, if you're already at the newest CDS version, shouldn't be updated tremendously. If you have a look at mine, you'll see that the database kind will change to SQL. In your case, that's most likely already the case. As you can see, the DB kind has changed to SQL, and I'll explain in a second what that means. And additionally, there is a HDI config in the source folder of our database module. So basically, both of our databases are SQL based, SQLite as well as SAP HANA Cloud. The only difference is once we compile the project for a specific target, there's a different output. So for example, if we have a look at CDS build, which basically builds all modules in the current project by compiling contained CDS sources. The modules are folders in the project root directory, all well-known files, DB, service, app, or those configured by build tasks defined in package.json or CDS/RC.json are built. So there's one needed flag, which is the -- production flag, builds the project using the production profile. Same when node environment variable is set to production. E.g. HANA deployment artifacts will be created if SQL has been set as database kind in the CDS configuration. So let's see if we trigger CDS build production, that the CAP compiler generates so-called .hdb CDS files as well as HDB table data files, which are the target files for SAP HANA as a service on SAP Cloud Platform. But as I said, we want to use SAP HANA Cloud in the SAP Cloud Platform trial. Therefore, we need a different output format. But before we actually go down that path, configuring our project for SAP HANA Cloud, let's also experiment with the CDS build command without the -- production. So without a HANA database as a target database. So as you can see, there's no HANA specific generated files. It's only the compiled CDS files into a so-called season file, which is the runtime information for CAP. So let's head over to the documentation and see if there is anything for using databases. And there's a section about SAP HANA and enhance the project configuration for SAP HANA Cloud. If we want to deploy our database artifacts to SAP HANA Cloud, we need to add the line here, which says that the deploying format is different from SAP HANA as a service on SAP Cloud Platform. Effectively, you will then get so-called HDB table and HDB view files generated in the folder we already have in our project because of the recent build command. So let's add that line. And execute the CDS build -- production once again. And as you can see, we now get HDB view and HDB table files. So before we actually deploy the whole project, including the database artifacts to SAP HANA Cloud and the runtime artifacts to SAP Cloud Platform Cloud Foundry, let's first try to run the project in our SAP Business Application Studio against a SAP HANA Cloud. Again, let's check the documentation. We first need to add a dependency. Simply run it in the bookshop root directory. Let's go back. And there is a CDS deploy command. So CDS deploy -- to HANA. You may remember it from a previous video where we used CDS deploy to deploy our database artifacts to SQLite. And there's a couple of things you need to know about CDS deploy -- to HANA. First, you need to be logged in to Cloud Foundry. CDS deploy -- to HANA command implicitly uses the Cloud Foundry CLI to create a service instance in your Cloud Foundry space. Secondly, what you don't need to know necessarily, but it's good to know it anyway, the CDS deploy -- to HANA command does several things. First, it compiles the CDS model to SAP HANA files in the gen/db directory. As you already know, it's the HDB view and HDB table files. Generates out of the CSV files we have in the project so-called HDB table data files. Uses the Cloud Foundry CLI to create a service instance of type HDI shared, which creates an HDI container. If you want to give the service instance a specific name, there's also the option to provide that with HANA : and then the service instance name. It runs a npm package in your project, so-called SAP HDI deploy, to connect to the service instance in your Cloud Foundry space, and pushes and sends the HDB view, HDB table, and HDB table data files to the service instance. Additionally, it puts a so-called default -env.json file with environment variables containing the information from the service instance on SAP Cloud Platform, so that you can then run the project locally, connecting to a SAP HANA Cloud instance on SAP Cloud Platform, without having the actual application runtime on SAP Cloud Platform, Cloud Foundry. So let's do that. First, we need to log into Cloud Foundry. If your endpoint isn't set yet, you can find the API endpoint in your SAP account information. Which is exactly the URL here. If you want to change your API endpoint, you can also use cf-login -a and then the API endpoint. Provide your email address and password. Choose the organization and the targeted space. And we'll then be able to use the CDS deploy -- to HANA command. Make sure your SAP HANA Cloud trial instance is up and running, otherwise you will face issues. As you can already see, the CDS deploy -- to HANA command is using the CF CLI implicitly and is creating the service instance in the background. If we're using the Cloud Foundry CLI now to check if the service instance was successfully created, just run cf services. And you can then see that I have a HANA Cloud instance called Bananas HANA and a Bookshop DB service instance of type HDI shared, which is actually the result of our CDS deploy -- to HANA command. So let's go on and try to run our app in the SAP Business Application Studio, connecting to our HDI container in the SAP HANA Cloud. The only thing you need to do is to switch the kind of the DB to HANA instead of SQLite. So if we start our application with CDS Watch, we can see that CAP is connecting to the SQLite database. If we change this one here, the application will restart because our JSON files are also monitored for changes. And you'll then see that we're actually connecting to a HANA database, which is the HANA Cloud one. And the actual information is retrieved from the default -env.json, with the information coming from the service instance called bookshop.db. So let's go back and change that back to SQL. And let's focus on how to deploy the application to SAP Cloud Platform Cloud Foundry. We'll deploy the whole application as one so-called multi-target application. And again, CDS CLI has a command for that. If we have a look for the help documentation, there's also a feature which you can add, which is called MTA. And this one adds a mta.yaml file with the CDS model and configuration for the CAP application in general. So let's do that. And you'll see that a mta.yaml file was created. Let's open the file and we can see several things. First of all, before everything else is executed, the multi-target build process will execute the following commands. First of all, it installs the node packages and then runs the CDS development kit to build the needed artifacts for our production environment. So that means that all the HANA, and then runs the CDS development kit with the command cds build -- production, so that all the needed artifacts by SAP HANA Cloud are also generated. Then we have several modules, which are in Cloud Foundry naming apps, and we have several resources, or in this case only one resource, which is the HDI container, which we just created using CDS deploy. So let's go through the modules. On the one hand side, we have our server module, which is of type Node.js, and the path where the artifacts are located is in the generated folder. And as you can see, compared to our service folder here, there's also an additional package.json and no CDS files anymore. So the runtime of CAP actually only needs the so-called season file and needs a descriptor of how the application should be run. If we have a look into the package.json file of the generated directory inside the service folder, we might not be surprised to see a command which we know already from our project, which we executed locally. So if we look into the package.json, that's also the start command with npx cds run, and it's exactly the same as in the generated service module. But we don't have any package.json here locally in our service directory. So that's all built by the cds build command. If we are going back to the mta.yaml file, we'll see that the application provides a parameter or a property, which is the SRV URL. So once the application is deployed to Cloud Foundry, it gets a default URL, which is available in the mta.yaml, and the property which we can reference later on is called SAV URL. Next, we have a so-called sidecar module, which is the Bookshop DB deployer, which is an equivalent to the CDS deploy command. So we can also create the service instance from the mta.yaml file, which is of type HDB. The path is in the generated directory, db, and has a package JSON as well, even though we didn't have any in here. The package JSON shows once the application gets started by Cloud Foundry, it starts a JavaScript file which deploys something using the HDI deploy mechanism. And it needs the information about the service instance of Bookshop DB so that the HDI deploy can connect to the actual HDI container, which is the resource down here. So what do we have in our mta.yaml file? We have a module, which is our Bookshop service. So everything we have in the SLV directory. We have the creation of a HDI container on the fly, just in case you want to create the HDI container using the MTA mechanism and not using the CDS deploy command. And we do have a module to actually deploy stuff to the HDI container. So what we are still missing is our actual UI inside the app directory. So we need an additional module called Bookshop UI of type Node.js. The path is the app directory. It needs a certain memory and a certain disk quota. And the most important thing is that it actually requires how to call the backend. This is using the SRV API coming from our Bookshop service. And it actually references the URL. To be able to use our application in Cloud Foundry, we need our app router. Therefore, let's create a package JSON and copy in the bit to start the app router. So once the application is deployed to Cloud Foundry is looking for a start script, and that actually starts the app router. The app router always needs a xsapp.json in order to know how to route, for example, incoming requests. Therefore, let's create a xsapp.json in the app directory. Let's have a look what we have. There are two different routing informations. Once a request is coming in containing web app in the URL, it just serves the information from the local directory web app. For everything else, it's forwarding the requests to the destination SRV API, which we also have in the mta.yaml file provided by the Bookshop service. So before we can go on and actually deploy the application to SAP Cloud Platform, we need to build the multi-target application, which results in a MTA archive. Therefore, there's the MBT tool, which helps to build multi-target applications. If we are using MBT build, the CLI is implicitly looking for a mta.yaml file in the same directory. So if we execute the command in the root directory of the project, it will automatically pick the mta.yaml file and generates an archive which we can then deploy to SAP Cloud Platform. As a result, we now have a MTA archives directory with a file containing the project name in the mta.yaml file concatenated with the version. We can now use the Cloud Foundry CLI to actually deploy the application to SAP Cloud Platform. Make sure you're still logged in. You can check with the target if you're still connected to your Cloud Foundry space. If that's the case, you can then use the Cloud Foundry CLI to reference the MTI archive. So a cf deploy bookshop.mtar will deploy the application to SAP Cloud Platform. In order to check the applications, let's use the CF CLI, and you should then see 3 different applications in the mti.yaml files that are called modules. We have the service in state started. We have the bookshop.db deployer, which is initially deploying the generated artifacts to SAP HANA Cloud. And we have the bookshop UI, which is actually the app router serving either the content in web app or routing the incoming requests to the bookshop service. To finally check if the application is working, let's copy the URL of the bookshop UI and see if we can query the data, which we already had in the application running locally in our SAP Business Application Studio. Here we go. We do have all the books we also had in our application in the SAP Business Application Studio. And we can also have a look at the object page. That's it, how to use SAP HANA Cloud as your database for your CAP Node.js based project, and how to deploy your application to the SAP Cloud Platform. Thanks for watching.